Before she became a princess, she was a girl the world chose to ignore. Long ago, in a peaceful and fertile kingdom far from the noise of great cities, there lived a young girl named Cinderella. The land where she was born was shaped by gentle hills, wide green fields, and forests that stretched quietly beneath the open sky. Clear rivers flowed slowly through the countryside, reflecting clouds that drifted without urgency. Life in this kingdom followed the rhythm of nature, calm and unhurried, as though time itself chose to move softly there. In one quiet corner of this land stood a large house surrounded by an open yard and old trees that cast long shadows in the afternoon light, long before sorrow entered its walls. The house had been filled with warmth and laughter. The sound of gentle footsteps echoed through its halls, and the windows often glowed warmly at night. This was the home where Cinderella spent her childhood, growing up surrounded by care and affection. From a very young age, Cinderella was known as a gentle and thoughtful child. She spoke softly, listened carefully, and noticed small details others often overlooked. She had a natural kindness that required no effort, as if compassion was simply a part of who she was. When someone was tired, she offered help. When someone was sad, she offered quiet company. Even as a child, she carried a calm presence that made others feel at ease. Cinderella's father was a merchant, an honest and hard-working man who traveled often. He did not seek wealth beyond what was needed for a simple and stable life. His journeys took him across dusty roads and into busy towns, where markets were filled with voices and movement. Whenever he returned home, he brought stories instead of treasures. He spoke of distant places, unfamiliar customs, and people whose lives followed paths very different from their own. Cinderella loved to sit beside him and listen. She would watch his face as he spoke, imagining the roads he had walked and the sights he had seen. Through his stories, her world grew wider, even though her feet never left the ground beneath their home. Those evenings, filled with quiet conversation and shared meals, became memories she would later hold close to her heart. Her mother was the heart of the household. She moved through the house with gentle grace, bringing warmth wherever she went. Her voice was calm, her touch reassuring. She believed deeply in patience, humility, and kindness. She often told Cinderella that life would not always be fair, and that pain was sometimes unavoidable. But a gentle heart would always find its way through hardship. Each night before sleep, her mother would sit beside Cinderella and speak softly about the world. She taught her that true strength did not come from power or anger, but from the ability to remain kind when kindness was difficult. She reminded her that bitterness only deepened wounds, while compassion allowed healing to begin. These words were spoken quietly, but they settled deeply within Cinderella, becoming a guiding light she would carry long after her mother's voice was gone. For several years, their life remained simple and content. The seasons passed gently. Spring brought fresh air and blooming fields. Summer brought warmth and long days. Autumn painted the land in gold and red, and winter wrapped the house in stillness. Cinderella grew under her parents' care, learning from their example rather than instruction alone. But happiness, like the seasons, does not last forever. One year, Cinderella's mother fell ill. At first, the sickness seemed small, no more than a passing weakness. Yet as days turned into weeks, her strength faded. The house grew quieter. Laughter became rare. Concern settled into every corner of their lives. Cinderella often sat beside her mother's bed, holding her hand, feeling its warmth grow weaker with each passing day. She spoke little, unsure of what words could ease such pain. Instead, she stayed close, offering presents when nothing else could be given. In her heart, she hoped with all her strength that her mother would recover, that life would return to the way it once was. One quiet morning, before the sun had fully risen, Cinderella's mother took her final breath. The world seemed to stop. The birds outside were silent, and the air felt heavy. Though still young, Cinderella understood that something precious had been taken from her forever. Grief settled into her chest, deep and aching. Yet even in that moment of loss, her mother's words echoed softly within her. Cinderella promised herself that she would not allow sorrow to turn into bitterness. She would remember the lessons she had been given and carry them forward, no matter how difficult the path ahead might become. After her mother's passing, Cinderella's father tried to hold their small world together. He worked longer hours and traveled more often, determined to provide stability for his daughter. Though his love remained strong, the absence of her mother's presence left a quiet emptiness in their home. The house still stood. The room still existed. But something essential was missing. As years passed, her father grew concerned. He worried that Cinderella needed guidance and care when he was away. Believing he was making the right choice, he decided to marry again. The woman he brought home arrived with 2 daughters of her own. At first, their manners were polite, their smiles carefully practiced. Cinderella hoped, once more, that warmth would return to her home. She wished for shared meals, gentle voices, and a sense of belonging. But beneath the surface, something cold and distant waited quietly, ready to reveal itself with time. And so, without knowing it, Cinderella stood at the edge of a life that was about to change. The peace of her early years slowly faded into memory, while a new chapter, shaped by hardship and endurance, prepared to unfold. After the marriage, the house that once felt warm slowly transformed into a place of quiet tension. At first, Cinderella tried to believe that patience and kindness would soften the hearts of her new stepmother and stepsisters. She greeted them each morning with respect and offered help whenever she could. She remembered her mother's words and held onto them tightly, believing that goodness would eventually be returned. However, as weeks passed, the true nature of her new family began to surface. Her stepmother was a woman who valued appearance, status, and control above all else. She spoke with a pleasant tone in public, but within the walls of the house, her voice often carried sharp edges. Her eyes observed constantly, measuring worth not by character but by usefulness. The stepsisters mirrored their mother in many ways. They were loud where Cinderella was quiet, demanding where she was considerate. They laughed easily at the discomfort of others and competed constantly for attention and praise. While Cinderella moved gently through the house, they filled rooms with impatience and complaint. At first, Cinderella was given simple tasks to help maintain the household. She cleaned, organized, and assisted in the kitchen. These duties felt reasonable, and she accepted them without complaint. She told herself that contribution was a form of belonging, and that perhaps shared work would bring them closer together. But soon, the tasks multiplied. What began as assistance became expectation. Then expectation turned into obligation. Cinderella found herself rising before dawn to prepare the house for the day. She swept floors that never seemed clean enough, washed clothes that piled endlessly, and prepared meals she was rarely invited to share. Her stepmother observed silently, rarely offering praise. When something was done well, it was expected. When something was imperfect, It was corrected sharply. Cinderella's presence became less like that of a daughter and more like that of a servant. Still, she endured quietly, believing that resistance would only deepen the divide. As her father traveled more frequently, the imbalance grew worse. In his absence, Cinderella's stepmother assumed full control of the household. She redistributed the rooms, moving Cinderella from her comfortable bedroom into a small space near the attic. The room was cold in winter and stifling in summer, but Cinderella accepted it without argument. From her small window, she could see the sky. At night, she often looked upward, watching stars appear one by one. In those moments, she allowed herself to remember the past. She remembered laughter, warm voices, and the gentle hands that once guided her. Though sadness lingered, she refused to let it harden her heart. Despite the hardship, Cinderella found comfort in small things. She spoke softly to the animals that wandered near the house. Birds perched near her window, drawn by crumbs she saved from meals she barely touched. Mice hid in corners, unafraid of her presence. In their quiet company, she felt less alone. The kitchen became the place where she spent most of her days. The scent of firewood, bread, and herbs filled the air. Though the work was tiring, she found a strange sense of peace in repetition. Her hands moved almost automatically, guided by habit rather than thought. In these moments, she felt grounded, focused, and calm. Her stepsisters, on the other hand, spent their days pursuing comfort and admiration. They practiced speaking and walking with exaggerated elegance, often mocking Cinderella as they passed her by. They criticized her appearance, her clothes, and her quiet nature. Their words were sharp, but Cinderella rarely responded. She chose silence over conflict, believing that dignity did not need defense. As time passed, Cinderella's appearance changed. Her clothes grew worn and faded, yet her presence remained gentle and composed. There was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself, one that did not seek attention but could not be entirely ignored. Even in hardship, her kindness remained intact. One afternoon, while cleaning the fireplace, Cinderella paused to rest. Ash covered her hands, and soot marked her face. She looked at her reflection faintly visible in a metal surface nearby and barely recognized herself. Yet instead of despair, she felt resolve. She reminded herself that circumstances did not define her worth. She whispered softly, as if speaking to the air itself, that she would endure. Not because she believed hardship was deserved, but because she believed her story was not finished. Somewhere beyond the walls of this house, she felt certain that life held more than endless labor and quiet suffering. That evening, as the household settled into rest, Cinderella returned to her small room. She lay on her narrow bed, listening to the wind move gently outside. Her body was tired, but her mind remained awake. Thoughts drifted between memory and hope, between what had been lost and what might still be possible. She did not yet know how her life would change, or when. She did not know that events beyond her control were slowly aligning. For now, she lived one day at a time, guided by patience, sustained by kindness, and strengthened by the belief that light could still exist, even in the darkest places. And so, Cinderella continued her quiet journey, unaware that the world beyond her small window was already beginning to take notice, and that the path ahead would soon open in ways she could never have imagined. Days passed quietly, blending into one another as Cinderella continued her routine. Morning arrived before sunrise, and night fell before she realized how much time had slipped away. Yet within that repetition, subtle changes were beginning to form. Changes she could not yet see, but could faintly feel. One morning, a royal announcement echoed throughout the village. A messenger rode through the streets, his voice clear and formal, carrying news from the palace. The king had declared that a grand royal ball would be held at the castle, lasting several evenings. The purpose was simple yet momentous. The prince was to meet all eligible young women in the kingdom, in hopes of choosing a future bride. Excitement spread quickly. Neighbors gathered to talk. Shops filled with chatter, and dreams stirred in many hearts. When the news reached Cinderella's home, the reaction was immediate and loud. Her stepsisters rushed through the halls, their voices overlapping with delight and ambition. Dresses were discussed, jewelry inspected, and appearances debated endlessly. Cinderella listened from the kitchen doorway, her hands paused mid-task. For a brief moment, her heart lifted. The thought of music, light, and joy awakened something deep within her. She imagined what it might feel like to stand in a grand hall, to hear laughter not tinged with cruelty, to be seen not as a servant but as herself. Gathering her courage, she approached her stepmother carefully. Her voice was soft, respectful, and hopeful as she asked whether she might attend the ball as well. The room fell silent. Her stepmother turned slowly, studying Cinderella with a gaze that revealed both surprise and disdain. "Attend the ball," she repeated, her tone cool and measured. She explained that Cinderella's responsibilities came first. The house would need to be spotless, meals prepared, and clothing arranged. Only if every task was completed perfectly would the idea even be considered. Though the conditions were heavy, Cinderella felt a spark of determination. She nodded, thanked her stepmother, and returned to her work with renewed energy. For the first time in a long while, her efforts were fueled by something other than obligation. They were guided by hope. From that day forward, Cinderella worked harder than ever before. She cleaned every corner of the house, polished surfaces until they gleamed, and prepared meals with care and precision. Even when exhaustion weighed on her body, she continued, driven by the belief that perseverance might open a door. As the days passed, she found an old dress stored away among forgotten belongings. It had once belonged to her mother. The fabric was simple but well made, and though time had faded its color, it carried warmth and memory. Cinderella gently repaired its seams, cleaned it carefully, and imagined wearing it to the ball. The stepsisters noticed her quiet preparations and reacted with amusement. They laughed at the dress, mocking its simplicity. Their words were sharp, and they treated Cinderella's hope as a source of entertainment. Still, she did not argue. She focused instead on her work and the fragile dream she carried inside. On the evening of the ball's first night, the house buzzed with activity. The stepsisters adorned themselves with extravagant gowns and accessories, calling for Cinderella repeatedly to assist them. She helped fasten clasps, arrange hair, and offer mirrors, all while suppressing the ache in her chest. When everything was ready, Cinderella finally changed into her repaired dress. She looked at herself briefly, unsure what to feel. The dress fit modestly, but it felt like a connection to a happier time. She stepped into the main room just as her stepmother entered. The reaction was immediate. Her stepmother's expression hardened, and without hesitation, she criticized the dress. The stepsisters joined in, pointing out flaws and imperfections. In a sudden outburst, they tore at the fabric, ripping seams and leaving the dress ruined. The moment was swift and devastating. Cinderella stood frozen, holding the torn fabric, her heart breaking silently. No words were spoken as her stepmother turned away and instructed her to clean up the mess. Moments later, the front door closed, and the sound of the carriage faded into the distance. Alone once again, Cinderella sank to the floor. The weight of disappointment pressed heavily upon her. She did not cry loudly. Instead, tears fell quietly, each one carrying the pain of broken hope. The house felt emptier than ever, and the silence seemed to echo her sorrow. She eventually made her way outside, seeking comfort in the night air. The garden was still, illuminated softly by moonlight. Cinderella sat beneath an old tree, holding the remains of the dress in her lap. She felt small and forgotten, yet something within her refused to completely give in to despair. As she whispered her sadness into the quiet night, a gentle warmth filled the air around her. The light grew slowly, softly, until it formed the shape of a kind and unfamiliar figure. Cinderella looked up, startled but not afraid. Before her stood a woman with a calm presence and a reassuring smile. Her voice, when she spoke, was gentle and steady. She told Cinderella that kindness, patience, and resilience never went unseen, and that the night was not yet over. Cinderella listened, uncertain but hopeful. The woman explained that she had come to help, but with certain conditions. Magic, she said, was powerful but temporary. It required trust, responsibility, and awareness of time. As the woman raised her hand, the air shimmered. Cinderella watched in awe as ordinary objects transformed into something extraordinary. The garden seemed to glow, and for the first time in a long while, wonder replaced sorrow in Cinderella's heart. She did not yet understand how deeply this moment would change her life. All she knew was that the night had shifted, and that the path ahead was no longer as dark as it once seemed. And as the magic continued to unfold, Cinderella stood at the edge of a destiny she had never dared to imagine, ready to step forward into a world that was finally opening its doors. The woman introduced herself as a fairy godmother, a guardian who appeared when hope was nearly lost but not entirely gone. Her presence carried no fear, only calm assurance, as if she had always been meant to arrive at this exact moment. Cinderella listened quietly, her heart still fragile yet slowly beginning to mend. With a gentle wave of her hand, the fairy godmother began her work. A large pumpkin resting near the garden path lifted softly into the air, glowing with warm light. Its shape shifted and expanded, forming elegant lines and shining surfaces. Within moments, it transformed into a magnificent carriage, complete with golden details and softly glowing lanterns. Nearby, small mice peeked from the shadows, curious and cautious. The fairy smiled and touched them lightly with her wand. One by one, they grew taller, their forms changing until they became strong, graceful horses. Their eyes reflected loyalty and calm, and they stood proudly as if they had always belonged to such a role. The transformation continued. A tired old dog became a dignified coachman, and a pair of lizards straightened themselves into uniformed footmen. Cinderella watched in silence, her breath caught between disbelief and awe. Everything she had known to be ordinary was now extraordinary, and yet nothing felt frightening or wrong. Finally, the fairy godmother turned her attention to Cinderella. She lifted the torn dress gently, and with a soft motion, restored it. The fabric shimmered, smoothing and strengthening, until it transformed completely before Cinderella's eyes. The simple garment became a gown of remarkable beauty. It glowed softly, not with excess, but with elegance and grace. The gown reflected Cinderella's true nature. Gentle, humble, and kind. It was not designed to impress through extravagance, but through quiet beauty. Glass slippers appeared at her feet, clear and delicate, yet perfectly formed to support her step. Cinderella felt transformed not only in appearance, but in spirit. She stood taller, her eyes brighter, her posture more confident. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as a servant, not as an afterthought, but as someone worthy of standing in the light. Before sending her on her way, the fairy godmother spoke once more. She warned that the magic was bound by time. At the stroke of midnight, everything would return to its original form. Cinderella must leave the ball before the final chime sounded. Cinderella promised she would remember. She thanked the fairy godmother with sincere gratitude, her voice steady despite the emotions rising within her. The fairy smiled, clearly pleased, and stepped back into the night as quietly as she had appeared. The carriage waited, its doors open in invitation. Cinderella stepped inside, her heart racing with excitement and uncertainty. As the horses began to move, she looked back once, seeing her small house and garden fading into the distance. She wondered if she would ever see them the same way again. The journey to the palace felt like a dream. The road shimmered beneath moonlight, and the air seemed filled with possibility. Cinderella watched as towers rose ahead of her, glowing warmly against the dark sky. Music drifted outward, welcoming all who approached. At the palace gates, guards opened the way without question. Cinderella stepped down from the carriage, her presence immediately drawing attention. Whispers followed her as she entered the grand hall, though no one recognized her face. Inside, the ball was in full motion. The hall was filled with music, laughter, and swirling lights. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, and the floor reflected the movement of countless dancers. Cinderella paused, overwhelmed by the beauty surrounding her. Across the room, the prince noticed her arrival. Something about her calm presence and quiet confidence drew his attention instantly. Without hesitation, he moved toward her, extending a hand with respectful curiosity. Cinderella accepted the invitation, her heart beating steadily as they joined the dance. As they moved together, the world around them seemed to fade. Their conversation flowed naturally, filled with gentle laughter and thoughtful pauses. For Cinderella, the night unfolded like a dream she had never dared to imagine. Time, however, moved relentlessly forward. As the clock neared midnight, a distant chime echoed softly through the hall. Cinderella felt a sudden urgency rise within her. She remembered the warning, and her expression changed. With a quick apology, she stepped away from the prince and hurried toward the exit. Confusion crossed his face as he followed, calling after her. The music continued behind them, unaware of the moment's gravity. As Cinderella reached the palace steps, the clock struck midnight. In her haste, one glass slipper slipped from her foot, left behind on the stone stairs. She did not stop to retrieve it. The magic was fading, and she knew she must go. The carriage vanished into the night, leaving the prince standing alone, holding the delicate slipper. He looked after the empty road, determined not to let the mystery end there. For Cinderella, the night ended quietly, but nothing within her was the same. She returned home unseen, her gown gone, her heart full. She lay awake until dawn, wondering if the magic had been real, and if the future might truly hold something more. And as the sun rose on a new day, the story moved forward. guided by a single glass slipper and the promise of a destiny yet to be fulfilled. Morning arrived softly, carrying with it the pale light of dawn and the quiet sounds of the countryside awakening. Cinderella rose early, as she always did, though her heart felt different. The memory of the night before lingered in her mind like a fragile dream she feared might disappear if she examined it too closely. Yet the faint ache in her chest reminded her that it had all been real. She returned to her daily chores as expected. The kitchen needed cleaning, the floors swept, and the ashes from the fireplace cleared away. Her stepmother and stepsisters moved about the house with their usual sharp voices and impatient demands. They spoke endlessly about the royal ball, about the prince, about the mysterious young woman who had captured everyone's attention. Cinderella listened in silence, her head lowered as she worked. She did not interrupt, nor did she reveal anything. She simply continued her tasks, though inside her thoughts were racing. Every mention of the ball made her heart tighten, especially when her stepsisters complained about how the prince had ignored them completely. They mocked the unknown girl, calling her arrogant for leaving so suddenly, and foolish for abandoning such an opportunity. Cinderella said nothing. She knew the truth, but she also knew that explaining it would only bring trouble. Some stories, she understood now, were meant to unfold on their own. Later that day, a royal proclamation echoed through the village. Trumpets sounded, drawing people from their homes and into the streets. A royal messenger announced that the prince would search the entire kingdom for the young woman whose foot fit the glass slipper left behind at the palace. Excitement spread quickly. Families whispered with anticipation. Young women rushed to prepare themselves, and hopes rose in every household. Cinderella stood at a distance, her hands trembling slightly as she listened. The glass slipper still existed. The night had not vanished into nothing. Her stepmother's eyes narrowed as she heard the announcement. She immediately turned to her daughters, commanding them to prepare. Dresses were laid out, hair carefully arranged, and practiced smiles rehearsed. The house buzzed with restless energy. Cinderella quietly asked if she might try on the slipper as well. The room fell silent for a moment before her stepmother laughed sharply. She dismissed the idea as ridiculous and ordered Cinderella back to work. The stepsisters joined in, mocking her gently at first, then cruelly, reminding her of her place. Cinderella did not argue. She simply nodded and returned to the kitchen, though her heart felt heavy. Still, a quiet strength remained within her. She remembered the fairy godmother's words, the kindness that had guided her, and the calm certainty she had felt while dancing at the palace. Days passed as the prince traveled from house to house. Each report that reached the village stirred both excitement and disappointment. One by one, hopeful young women tried on the slipper, only to find it did not fit. Some wept, others protested, but the result was always the same. Finally, the royal procession arrived at Cinderella's home. The stepsisters rushed forward eagerly, nearly tripping over their own gowns. The slipper was presented with great care, as if it were a priceless treasure. Each sister tried in turn, forcing their feet forward, ignoring the pain and discomfort. But the slipper remained unmoved, refusing to fit where it did not belong. The prince's attendant prepared to leave, disappointment evident on his face. At that moment, Cinderella stepped forward once more. Her voice was soft but steady as she asked to try. Her stepmother attempted to stop her, claiming there was no need. But the attendant insisted that every eligible young woman be given a chance. Reluctantly, they allowed Cinderella to step closer. She knelt calmly, her movements unhurried. When she placed her foot into the glass slipper, it slid on perfectly, as if it had always been meant for her alone. The room fell into stunned silence. Gasps filled the air. The stepsisters stared in disbelief. The stepmother's face hardened, unable to deny what stood plainly before her. To remove all doubt, Cinderella reached into her pocket and produced the other glass slipper, kept safe since the night of the ball. There was no longer any question. The royal attendant bowed deeply, recognizing her at last. Cinderella was invited to accompany them to the palace. As she prepared to leave, she looked once more at the house that had been both her shelter and her prison. She felt no triumph, no desire for revenge. Instead, she felt relief, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. The journey to the palace this time was different. There was no magic, no glowing carriage. Yet everything felt more real. Cinderella sat quietly, watching the road pass by, aware that her life was changing not through sudden enchantment, but through truth being revealed. When she arrived, the prince recognized her immediately. His expression softened into a smile filled with warmth and certainty. He greeted her not as a mystery, but as someone he had truly hoped to see again. They spoke at length, not of grandeur or status, but of their lives, their values, and their hopes. Cinderella spoke honestly about her past, about hardship and patience, about choosing kindness even when it was difficult. The prince listened carefully. He saw not just the woman before him, but the strength behind her gentleness. In her presence, he felt peace rather than excitement alone, and he understood that this feeling was rare. From that day forward, Cinderella's place in the palace grew naturally. She was not rushed into ceremony or spectacle. Instead, she was welcomed gradually, allowed to remain herself, without pretense or pressure. Though her life had changed, her heart remained grounded. She knew the path ahead would not be free of challenges, but she also knew she would face them with the same quiet resilience that had carried her through her darkest days. And so, the story continued, not as a sudden ending, but as the steady beginning of a life shaped by patience, truth, and enduring kindness. Life at the palace unfolded slowly, like a story that refused to rush toward its ending. Cinderella was given a chamber overlooking the inner garden, where roses bloomed in careful rows and fountains murmured softly throughout the day. Each morning, sunlight filtered through tall windows, warming the stone floors and reminding her that this life was real, not another fragile dream. She was introduced to the rhythms of palace life with patience and respect. Servants did not command her as before, nor did they look past her existence. Instead, they greeted her kindly, some with curiosity, others with quiet admiration. Cinderella responded to everyone in the same way, with gentle words and sincere gratitude. Uncomfortable at first with the attention, yet determined not to let it change her, the prince made time to walk with her through the gardens, away from the formality of court. In those moments, they spoke freely. Cinderella listened as he described the weight of responsibility he carried, the expectations placed upon him since childhood, and the loneliness that often accompanied his position. For the first time, he felt he could speak without performing a role. Cinderella understood more than he expected. Though her life had been very different, she too knew what it meant to endure in silence, to be seen only for what others demanded rather than who she truly was. Their shared understanding formed a bond deeper than excitement or admiration. Yet not everyone at court welcomed Cinderella so easily. Some nobles whispered behind silk fans, questioning her background and worthiness. They measured her by her past, by her lack of noble blood, by the simplicity of her manner. Cinderella noticed the glances and heard fragments of conversation, but she did not confront them. Instead, she chose consistency. Day after day, she remained kind, thoughtful, and attentive. She learned the names of those who worked in the palace kitchens, asked about their families, and offered help when she could. Slowly, resistance softened. Even those who doubted her found it difficult to deny her sincerity. The Queen, wise and observant, watched Cinderella closely. She did not judge hastily. One afternoon, she invited Cinderella to tea in a quiet room filled with books and soft light. Their conversation was long and unguarded. Cinderella spoke openly about her upbringing, her losses, and the lessons she had learned through hardship. The Queen listened in silence. When Cinderella finished, she reached across the table and gently took her hand. She said that courage did not always roar, and strength did not always announce itself. Sometimes, it lived quietly within those who chose compassion again and again. From that day on, the Queen became one of Cinderella's greatest allies. As weeks passed, Cinderella was invited to attend councils and gatherings, not as a figure to be admired, but as a voice to be heard. At first, she spoke little, observing carefully, but when she did speak, her words were thoughtful and grounded in lived experience. She reminded others that decisions made within palace walls echoed far beyond them. The prince valued her insight. He began to rely on her perspective, especially when matters concerned the welfare of ordinary people. Together, they discussed ways to improve conditions in villages, to support families struggling through poor harvests, and to ensure fairness in labor. Cinderella never forgot the feeling of being unseen. That memory guided her choices, keeping her rooted in humility. News from her former home eventually reached the palace. Her stepmother and stepsisters lived quietly now. Their influence diminished. Some urged Cinderella to sever all ties completely, but she hesitated. Her heart was no longer burdened by anger. She believed that carrying resentment would only chain her to the past. One evening, she spoke to the prince about forgiveness, not as an obligation, but as a release. He listened, thoughtful, and respected her decision to leave that chapter closed without bitterness. As seasons changed, the kingdom began to shift subtly. Policies influenced by empathy replaced those built solely on tradition. People felt the difference, even if they could not name its source. The name Cinderella spread not as a fairy tale, but as a symbol of gentle reform. Despite the growing admiration, Cinderella guarded her inner life carefully. At night, she often sat by her window, gazing at the stars. She remembered the girl she had once been, whispering hopes into the darkness. She honored that girl by staying true to herself. The prince, sensing the depth of her reflection, never rushed her. He understood that love, like trust, needed space to grow naturally. Their bond deepened not through grand declarations, but through shared silence, shared purpose, and shared resolve. And as the kingdom watched their connection strengthen, it became clear that Cinderella's journey was not about transformation through magic, but about becoming fully seen for who she had always been. The story was far from over. In truth, it was only beginning, shaped now by choice, patience, and the steady courage to live with an open heart. As the months passed, Cinderella's presence began to reshape not only the palace, but the rhythm of the entire kingdom. Change did not arrive suddenly or loudly. It moved quietly, like dawn spreading light without announcing itself. Villagers noticed that officials listened longer. Workers felt that their voices carried weight. Mothers spoke of schools that finally welcomed their children without demanding impossible fees. Cinderella never claimed credit for these shifts. When praised, she redirected attention to the people themselves, insisting that wisdom lived among them long before it reached the palace. This humility only deepened the respect others felt for her. The prince, now preparing to take on greater responsibility as future king, often sought her counsel late into the night. Maps, reports, and letters would be spread across long tables, candles burning low as they spoke of roads, harvests, and justice. Cinderella approached each issue with the same care she once gave to simple household tasks. To her, every detail mattered, because every detail touched a life. Yet with responsibility came exhaustion. There were days when Cinderella felt the weight of expectations press heavily on her chest. On those days, she returned to the gardens alone. She would walk slowly along familiar paths, letting the scent of flowers and the sound of water steady her breathing. She reminded herself that she did not need to be perfect. She only needed to be honest. One afternoon, during such a walk, she encountered a young servant girl crying quietly beside the hedge. The girl feared punishment for a mistake she had made. Cinderella sat beside her, listening patiently, offering comfort rather than judgment. Word of this simple kindness spread quickly, reinforcing what many already believed, that Cinderella saw people, not roles. The queen observed all of this with deep satisfaction. She recognized in Cinderella the qualities she herself had learned over a lifetime of leadership. One evening, she shared stories of her own early struggles, of mistakes made and lessons learned. It was the first time Cinderella realized that even queens once felt unsure of their place. Their bond grew strong, rooted in mutual respect rather than formality. The queen encouraged Cinderella to trust her instincts, reminding her that empathy was not a weakness, but a form of strength few possessed. Meanwhile, preparations for a formal engagement began to stir quietly within the palace. The prince wished to proceed thoughtfully, ensuring that Cinderella felt no pressure. When he finally spoke to her, he did so not as a ruler, but as a man. He told her that his life felt fuller with her beside him, and that he wished to build the future together, step by step. Cinderella did not answer immediately. She asked for time, not out of doubt, but out of reverence for the choice before her. That night, she returned to her chamber and sat in silence, reflecting on the path that had led her here. She thought of the girl who once slept beneath the roof beams of a dusty attic, dreaming not of crowns, but of peace. By morning, her answer was clear. She agreed, not because of the palace or the promise of security, but because the partnership offered respect, shared purpose, and understanding. The announcement, when it came, was met with celebration throughout the kingdom. Bells rang, banners were raised, and people gathered in town squares to rejoice. Yet even in celebration, Cinderella remained grounded. She insisted that festivities include everyone, from nobles to laborers, believing joy should never be reserved for a few. As plans unfolded, Cinderella took an active role, not in extravagance, but in meaning. She chose symbols that reflected unity and renewal. She invited artisans from distant villages to contribute, ensuring that the celebration carried the spirit of the entire realm. Still, there were moments of quiet doubt. Late at night, she wondered if she truly belonged in this world of ceremony and scrutiny. In those moments, she returned to the lessons of her past. Belonging, she realized, was not granted by place or title, but by the integrity one carried within. The prince sensed her unease and reassured her, not with promises, but with presence. He listened. He waited. He trusted her pace. Their relationship deepened through patience rather than urgency. As the engagement drew nearer, Cinderella visited the outskirts of the kingdom one last time as a private citizen. She walked among fields and homes, listening to stories without guards or announcements. She wanted to remember these voices clearly, to carry them with her into the life ahead. When she returned to the palace, she felt ready. The girl who had once survived by endurance now stepped forward by choice. Her journey had not erased her past, but woven it into something stronger. And as the kingdom prepared to witness the next chapter of her life, Cinderella stood steady, knowing that whatever lay ahead, she would face it with the same quiet courage that had guided her all along. The days leading up to the wedding unfolded with a calm that surprised many within the palace. Rather than chaos or excessive display, Cinderella encouraged simplicity and intention. She believed that moments of transition deserved reflection, not haste. As a result, preparations moved steadily, guided by care rather than urgency. Cinderella spent much of her time meeting with people who would soon be affected by her new role. She spoke with teachers, healers, farmers, and craftsmen, asking not what they expected from a future queen, but what they needed most from their leaders. These conversations were not ceremonial. They were quiet, sincere, and often deeply moving. One elderly farmer spoke of land that had been in his family for generations, now threatened by debt. A young teacher described classrooms too crowded for learning. A healer shared stories of villages too far from care. Cinderella listened, committing each concern to memory. She did not promise miracles. She promised effort. At night, she recorded these conversations in a simple journal. Its pages were not adorned with gold, only ink and intention. She wrote not as royalty, but as someone who understood what it meant to struggle without a voice. This journal became her compass, grounding her amid growing expectations. The palace itself seemed to respond to her presence. Where once halls echoed with formality, now they carried warmth. Laughter found its way into corners long reserved for silence. Even the guards, once rigid and distant, softened in her presence, greeting her with genuine respect. The queen watched these changes with quiet pride. She knew that leadership rooted in humanity would outlast any reign built on fear. One evening, she invited Cinderella to walk with her beneath the moonlight. As they strolled, the queen spoke of legacy, not in terms of monuments or history books, but in the lives quietly improved. Cinderella absorbed every word. She understood now that power, when guided by empathy, could heal rather than divide. She felt both humbled and strengthened by this realization. As the wedding approached, messengers arrived from distant regions, bearing gifts and blessings. Some were extravagant, others modest. Cinderella accepted them graciously, but insisted that many be redistributed to communities in need. Celebration, she believed, should ripple outward. Not all reactions were warm. There were still voices of doubt, whispers questioning her origin and suitability. Cinderella no longer allowed these murmurs to unsettle her. She had learned that approval was fleeting, but purpose endured. In moments of solitude, she returned to memories of her childhood. She remembered the ache of loss, the long days of labor, the quiet resilience forged in loneliness. Rather than push these memories away, she embraced them, They reminded her why she chose compassion over pride. The prince noticed her reflective mood and joined her often in these moments. They spoke not only of the kingdom, but of life they hoped to build together. They discussed balance, rest, and the importance of staying connected to one another beyond duty. Their partnership was built not on illusion, but on honesty. On the eve of the wedding, Cinderella asked for time alone. She walked through the palace one final time as she had known it, touching stone walls, standing in doorways, acknowledging the transformation that had taken place within and around her. She paused in the gardens, listening to the night. She thought of her mother, of the words spoken long ago about kindness surviving hardship. She realized that those words had guided her every step. They had carried her through darkness and into light, not as a reward, but as a continuation of who she had always been. When she returned to her chamber, she felt calm. There was no fear, no doubt, only gratitude and resolve. Morning arrived softly. The sky glowed with pale color, and bells rang gently across the city. People gathered not out of obligation, but joy. The air was filled with anticipation, yet free of excess. Cinderella dressed simply, choosing garments that reflected grace rather than grandeur. As she looked into the mirror, she did not see a queen tobe. She saw a woman shaped by endurance, guided by empathy, and ready to serve. As she stepped forward to meet her future, she carried with her every lesson learned along the way. The journey that began in silence now continued in purpose. And as the kingdom held its breath, waiting to witness the union, Cinderella walked with steady confidence, knowing that whatever title she carried, her true strength would always come from her heart. The ceremony that followed was quiet and sincere. Words were spoken with intention. Promises were made not only to one another, but to the people they would serve. There were no illusions of perfection, only commitment to growth. And as the final vows were exchanged, the story of Cinderella moved beyond transformation and into responsibility. Her life was no longer defined by what she had escaped, but by what she chose to build. The path ahead would not be easy, but it would be meaningful. And that, Cinderella knew, was enough. After the wedding, life did not slow down. If anything, it became fuller, layered with new responsibilities and quieter challenges. Cinderella stepped into her role not with ceremony, but with attention. She observed first, learning how the kingdom truly moved beneath its polished surface. Mornings often began with meetings, yet she insisted they remain grounded. Reports were read, but she asked questions beyond numbers. She wanted to know how policies felt to those living under them. Were people safer? Were children fed? Were workers treated with dignity? These questions slowly reshaped how decisions were made. Some advisors resisted at first. They were accustomed to tradition, to distance between rulers and the ruled. Cinderella did not confront them harshly. She listened, responded calmly, and demonstrated through action. Over time, even the most skeptical began to see results. When unrest lessened and trust grew, resistance softened. Cinderella made it a habit to leave the palace regularly, sometimes announced, often not. She walked through markets, visited schools, and sat quietly in village gatherings. She listened more than she spoke. People were hesitant at first, unsure how to speak freely before a queen. But her presence, unguarded and patient, invited honesty. Children approached her without fear. Elders spoke without rehearsed words. In these moments, Cinderella felt most certain of her place, not above others, but among them. The king supported her fully. He admired her approach, even when it challenged his own habits. Together, they learned how to lead side by side, balancing vision with care. Their conversations deepened, extending beyond governance into shared reflection. They spoke of rest, of boundaries, of preserving the parts of themselves untouched by power. There were difficult days, decisions that could not please everyone, losses that no policy could prevent. On those days, Cinderella felt the familiar ache of helplessness. She reminded herself that leadership did not grant control over life, only responsibility toward it. At night, she returned to her journal. The pages grew thick with ink, filled with names, stories, and questions still unanswered. This ritual anchored her, a reminder that progress was built one thoughtful step at a time. News from neighboring kingdoms began to arrive. Visitors came not only to observe, but to learn. They spoke of changes noticed from afar, of a kingdom quieter yet stronger. Cinderella welcomed dialogue, believing wisdom grew through exchange rather than isolation. Still, she guarded against pride. She knew how quickly admiration could distort purpose. When praise grew loud, she sought silence. When certainty tempted her, she asked questions. This balance did not come easily, but it was one she practiced daily. One evening, during a modest gathering, a former servant approached her. The woman thanked Cinderella for creating conditions where people felt seen. Cinderella listened, humbled. She understood then that change was not measured by grand gestures, but by moments like this. Quiet recognition, shared humanity. As seasons turned again, the kingdom settled into a new rhythm. Not perfect, never complete, but steadier, kinder. Cinderella accepted that her story was no longer about transformation alone. It was about maintenance, about choosing care again and again, even when it went unnoticed. She often thought back to the attic, to the silence she once endured. That memory remained with her, not as pain, but as guidance. It reminded her of why patience mattered, why listening mattered, why dignity must never be withheld. Standing at her window one night, watching lanterns flicker across the city, Cinderella felt a quiet resolve. The path ahead would stretch long, filled with challenges she could not yet imagine. But she had learned that strength was not found in certainty. It was found in compassion sustained over time. And so, without spectacle, without magic, Cinderella continued forward. Not as a symbol, but as a woman choosing, each day, to lead with an open heart. Time continued its steady passage, and with it came moments that tested everything Cinderella believed. Prosperity brought new expectations, and peace revealed problems once hidden beneath survival. Cinderella learned that leadership was not a destination, but a continuous act of attention. There were years of abundance, when harvests were kind and laughter filled the streets. And there were years of hardship, when storms damaged crops and illness spread fear. In those difficult seasons, Cinderella did not retreat behind palace walls. She stood present, sharing uncertainty rather than masking it with false assurance. The people did not demand perfection. They asked for honesty, and she gave it. As she matured, Cinderella became less concerned with how history would remember her. She focused instead on the present moment, on the child who needed schooling, on the worker who needed rest, on the widow who needed to be heard. These small acts, repeated endlessly, formed the true legacy of her reign. The king remained her closest companion. Together, They learned when to act and when to wait. Their partnership was not without disagreement, but it was rooted in mutual respect. When they differed, they listened. When they failed, they admitted it. Love, they discovered, was not diminished by challenge, but strengthened by shared accountability. Cinderella never abandoned the quiet rituals that sustained her. She still wrote in her journal. She still walked alone when she needed clarity. She still returned to gardens and stars when the weight of responsibility grew heavy. These moments preserved the part of her untouched by title. As years turned into decades, new generations rose who knew Cinderella only as their queen. Few remembered the girl in ashes. Fewer still understood the distance she had traveled within herself. Yet traces of that journey lived on in the way laws were shaped, in the tone of governance, in the dignity woven into everyday life. One evening, long after celebrations and trials alike had faded into memory, Cinderella stood once more at a window overlooking the kingdom. Lights glimmered softly below. The world felt neither triumphant nor tragic. It felt alive. She reflected not on what she had gained, but on what she had chosen. Kindness over bitterness, patience over resentment, presence over power. These choices, she knew, had shaped her life far more than magic ever could. Cinderella understood now that her story had never truly been about escape. It had been about endurance, about the courage to remain gentle in a world that often rewarded hardness. It had been about becoming visible without losing humility. And so her story settled into something quieter than legend, yet deeper than myth, a reminder passed from one voice to another, that circumstances may shape our path, but character shapes our direction. Long after crowns tarnished and walls crumbled, what endured was not the image of a girl transformed by magic, but the memory of a woman who chose goodness, again and again, until it became the foundation of everything she built. And in that way, Cinderella's story never truly ended. It continued wherever someone, unseen and unheard, chose to remain kind, trusting that even the quietest strength could one day change the course of a life.